Good morning, everybody. My name is Dan Bloomfield. I'm from the TEVI project, or on the TEVI project at the University of Exeter. And I am going to kick things off with this, the fourth of a series of webinars, looking at the good growth principles of the Cornwall iteration of the Shared Prosperity Fund as being run from the Good Growth Hub. So we're going to run through a quite broad agenda of some very hefty issues in an hour or less. So you'll be glad to know that the slide pack that you're about to view will be made available to everybody, and that you don't need to worry about missing any of the links or examples that we give. So, as I said, I'm part of University of Exeter's Impact, Innovation and Business Directorate. And on the next slide, you'll see a beautiful logo of our organisation. Hey, and we're based at the Penryn campus. So, on the next slide, just a quick bit of housekeeping. We are recording this for future use, so please be aware of that. If you have any queries, please raise them in the chat, and if you have any more detailed follow-on questions, either about the sort of process of applying for the Good Growth Fund or the content of these slides, I'll explain how to follow up those queries at the end after we've heard from everybody. So this is the structure of what we're about to run through, and we have a fair cast to present this play to today. In a minute, I'm going to ask Stefan, my colleague Stefan Boehm at the University of Exeter. Professor Boehm has done a huge amount of work on the TEVI project over the last 5 years or so, and we'll cover off what he's learned about these sorts of issues. We're going to get down to it in a bit more detail then. Chris is going to cover both the carbon and energy and circular economy, or possibly that's not true. I think actually that's Peter this time around. I'll be back to talk about nature. Jim is here to go through the good growth principles that underpin so much of sound business practice, and then we'll go through the ED&I agenda. This time not with Ruth, but with Kirsten. Okay, I'll hand over to you, Stefan, and perhaps you can kick us off for sure.
Okay, I am really Stefan in my flesh. This is in my younger youth, this picture, but yeah, very nice to be here. So as Dan said, I've been co-leading the TEVI program, which some of you might have heard about for the last 5 or more years now. Actually, we've done a huge amount of business assist on the back of Cornwall Council's environmental growth strategy, helping businesses to work towards the circular economy, as well as invest in nature. So regenerative approaches to nature recovery and running a business in line with nature principles. My research has really, over the last 20 odd years, has really focused on trying to find this sweet spot between environmental issues, economic issues, and social issues. So I'm based in a business school. My official title is Professor in Organization Sustainability. So I am interested in what businesses and organizations do, but always in line with how the economic agenda can be squared with the environmental and the social agenda. So, and that's pretty much, if we go to the next slide, please, that's pretty much the main logic of the good growth program that is part of the Shared Prosperity Fund that the government has initiated. In Cornwall, it's called Good Growth. But it's really trying to bring these three things together, also called the triple bottom line. If you had that term, it's been around for the last 25 years, really. But people have talked a lot about the triple bottom line. Very rarely organizations actually achieve that in their practice. So, the economic side often prevails for obvious reasons. The bottom line is often the driving force. And that is still very much important, particularly, in terms of improving productivity in Cornwall, which is an ongoing problem, and, economic development and innovation is a key part of what good growth here in Cornwall should look like. But it's not enough. So all applications, if you decide to go for this opportunity, all applications have to not just tick the economic development box, but it also has to tick the clean and green box, as well as the social box, as it were. And of course, they're not boxes, they're real people behind them in real nature and real things. So it's not meant to be a box ticking exercise, but so we want to encourage you to really think of very innovative, path-breaking projects that address all these three aspects of the triple bottom line. And if we go to the next slide, you will see in more detail what we actually mean by these three dimensions. So on the clean and green side, we have things like CO2 emissions. Of course, climate change is one of our key priorities that everybody needs to address, and Cornwall Council has really emphasized that very strongly for the last 5 years. But carbon is not enough. So greenhouse gas emissions are very important, but the clean and green agenda is much broader than that. So, we don't want to become carbon fetishists or, just looking at number crunching of carbon, because that in itself can be very reductionist and can be very narrow. So the wider circular economy looks at how we can make our economies more circular in terms of moving what used to be waste, i.e. resources, around and reusing these resources and again. Recovery is very important. So doing less harm is also not good enough anymore. We need to actually regenerate nature. And there's the environmental growth strategy that's been in existence for the last 5 or 6 years here in Cornwall in the Isles of Scilly. There's a document available if you search for that. Has been talking about that for a while now. So particularly here in Cornwall, where a lot of legacy from mind and agriculture has, basically is requiring us to recover and regenerate nature. So that's the clean and green agenda. And on the business and economic side, things there will not surprise you around jobs, and not just any jobs, but jobs that ideally pay a real living wage. As we all know, jobs are sometimes hard to come by, and real jobs in Cornwall in particular, we have a lot of seasonal jobs, very contract, 0-hour contract type of jobs. purely paid jobs. The projects we encourage you to think about is our projects that address that problem, and also projects that improve productivity. So in the whole of UK, there's a productivity gap compared to our European neighbours, but in Cornwall in particular, we are in the bottom third of UK productivity rates. So skills and training is very important as well. So all these kind of new industries, these new jobs that are coming to Cornwall, speaking of spaceport, offshore wind, mining and other kind of new growth agendas, all of that needs skills and jobs. And on the social side, very important as well, equality and diversity. It used to be a kind of an afterthought, and now it's becoming center stage. So things around age discrimination, disability, gender, race, religion, sexual orientation, etc. All of these things have become very important over the last few years and now are treated as equals, in line with the importance of the clean and green and economic and business agendas. So we want you to think about projects that address all of these at the same time. Next slide, please. All projects, all businesses, all organizations that apply need to have an environmental sustainability policy, as well as an equality and diversity policy. We'll come on to that later on. I think Kirsten will talk about that. So we fully expect that not all organizations have that in place, but help is at hand. You can email us and get in touch at TEVI. We can send you a template for that. And as I said, environmental sustainability is not meant to be a box ticking exercise. We want you to be bold and really go beyond the status quo and beyond business as usual. So when you draft your environmental sustainability policy, we want you to not just think about how to do less harm and how to slowly improve things, but we want you to really think about a step change and how you can really move things along much more quickly and much more systemically, within your reach. A single organization can't do everything, but through collaboration with others, you can have a much broader reach beyond organizational boundaries. Think through, have a read of the environmental growth strategy that I mentioned already on this web page there, and there you have 10 pillars that will be important to think about when you think about your sustainability policy. Okay, I think that's me done, and I hand over to Pete, I believe. Is that right, Dan?
Yeah, that's right. Thanks, Stefan. So hi everyone, I'm Peter Lefort. I work at the University of Exeter as well. I'm going to talk through these first couple of examples around the clean and green part of the principles. So this first section is around carbon and energy, and I've just got at the top there a line from the Green Growth Principle guidelines around what everyone would be expected to do in submitting for this is describing your impact on climate change. So really considering how that works, as Stefan was talking about, across a range of different metrics, and thinking about it quite holistically. The Cornwall and Isles of Scilly has an ambition to be carbon neutral by 2030, and UK government has enshrined in law that there will be a net zero target reached in the UK by 2050. So this is something that's very heavily on the agenda. So how can the projects in this fund support a reduction in CO2 emissions is going to be really, really key. So I've got a few examples here of reducing carbon, which is a big part of this process. So how can we do what we're doing in a way that creates less CO2 or CO2 equivalent in the atmosphere? And this can include different scopes of carbon emissions, scopes 1, 2, and 3, and say a little bit more about those in a bit and how you can find out more information. But just some examples here to start thinking. Some of these will be very obvious, and it's really important to include those, but start to go beyond the obvious as well. So thinking about energy, obviously getting energy from renewable sources has a much lower carbon footprint than using fossil fuels, but also the infrastructure of the energy you use, which can be as small as the light bulbs you have, but there are many other ways that you can be thinking about how you are generating and using energy. Transport is a key one, thinking about are there low carbon methods of transport that can be used in your operations, whether it's about moving resources around, whether it's about moving people around, what role is transport playing, and what can you look at there, which could include the fuel of that transport and what alternatives are available to you. And then lastly here, thinking about measurement, which is really, really key. So do you have a baseline in place to then be able to show what your carbon reduction has achieved, how that has changed over time? Do you have those metrics in place? And if not, there is plenty of support out there, and I'll share a couple of links in a minute of where you can get started if you're not already on that journey. Next slide. But the other part of this is not just reducing the carbon that we produce, but also reducing the demand for it, which can be easy to overlook, but it's really, really crucial. So again, some ideas here that you may very well be familiar with, thinking about energy. Can we reduce the amount of energy that we need to use to heat or cool our homes through installation or our office premises or buildings? So not just using renewable energy that is lower carbon, but reducing the demand for it in the first place. And there's home working is also something that we need to consider here as what is the impact of home working on our energy use? Who is responsible for the energy that our staff are using at home, or the energy used by our customers or clients by working with them? Really thinking about that wider systemic impact of energy demand through the work that we're doing and the projects that we're trying to get funding for. Transport here, obviously you've got a cyclist there as a way of just reducing the demand for carbon in the first place by using transport that doesn't require those fuels. And also the symbol below that is representing supply chains and networks and infrastructure. So what is it that we're moving around? Can we do that less? Can we get things from closer, or can we ship things, transport things in a more efficient way so that we're reducing the amount of transportation that needs to be done in the first place? And then lastly here around education, which is a huge part of reducing the demand in the first place. Pushing people towards behavior change in ways that is empowering and inclusive and supportive. So there's lots of resources and ideas around carbon and climate literacy to support people to change their behaviors. And that symbol there on the bottom right is the kind of switching things off standby, which is a really simple, basic example that people can do, but there's much more that can be done through behavior change, really within a project, within an organization, embedding that culture of a reduction of carbon and energy demand. Next slide, please. So here are some tools that can be used. So you can access these links when you get the slides later on. There's some really good free tools out there that you can go through to work out what your emissions baseline might be, work out how you can start to reduce those emissions. Hopefully, again, you're already on that journey, but there's always more that we can do. If you're just looking, for example, at scopes 1 and 2, the energy that you're bringing in and the direct emissions that you're creating, how can you then start looking at scope 3 carbon emissions, the indirect emissions that maybe are harder for you to track or measure? but how do we start looking at that so that we can demonstrate the action that is being taken to reduce that those carbon emissions and your wider impact. There's a link there as well to the work on the Let's Talk Cornwall website, some toolkits there around carbon literacy training. And in May of this year, there'll be a best practice guide to net zero from TEVI. So do ask us for a copy later in a couple of months. Next slide. Second, once you've thought about energy and carbon, is then thinking about circular economy. So again, this might be a term that you are very familiar with, but just to briefly explain that here, on the left-hand side, we have what is a kind of traditional linear economy. And this is an economy or a process that operates on the assumption that we can just take whatever we want. The resources are out there, they're infinite. We can turn it into what we want. We can use that, and then we can get rid of it at the end of that process. And this has been the dominant form of resource use for a very long time. We are starting to understand, and many organizations and projects are really far down this line of recognizing that this isn't necessarily the case. We don't have infinite resources, and we can't just throw things away when we're finished with them. So we're really shifting to this further onto the right on this diagram. So the recycling economy, again, very, very familiar. Instead of throwing things out once we finish with them, how do we repurpose, recycle, bring the value of those resources back into that process, that chain, and then use them again, make them again, and eventually moving towards this model on the right hand side, the circular economy, where we still are going to have to take and use and create some finite resources, but it's a much more closed loop system, a much more circular system, where we are not only just recycling, we're also repairing, we're reusing, we're returning things to source, and keeping resources moving in that value chain. So there's a really important consideration when you're designing your projects and just defining the impact that they will have, is thinking about what is the impact on all of the resources and all of the value that we are creating and using. What is going to happen to it at the end of its life? Just recycling is not the answer. We have moved past that to a much more circular way of looking at things. Next slide, please. So there's some great questions on here that I really encourage you to go through in detail on your own when you're thinking about your projects, and really think about, have you considered every single bullet point on this list? So can whatever you are creating, whether it's a product, whether it's a service, is circularity embedded within that? Can it be easily repaired when parts of it stop working, for example? Can components be replaced rather than the whole thing having to be thrown away? Can elements of it be reused or repurposed in other processes or other resources? Can the materials ultimately be recycled easily at the end of their life? Where does that recycling take place? And really designing the whole process with minimal waste in it. There's always going to be some leakage from that system, but how do we make sure that's as minimal as possible? And this idea of ownership of that process from cradle to grave. So are we delegating that responsibility to someone else, or are we taking ownership of, we know exactly where these resources are throughout the whole process? We're aware of that, and we're taking responsibility for that. There's also some bullet points here around treating waste as an asset. This idea that things become less useful, we throw them away. Again, we are moving away from that. So what can we do with what is waste from one system or one process and turn it into something valuable for somewhere else? Can other organizations use what we are terming waste from our products? And can we buy back the end-of-life products that maybe we've sold or given out as part of our work, to then repurpose them and bring them back into our own value chain? And then thinking about the equipment that we use ourselves, do we need to own everything? Can we rent them? Can we lease them? Can we have a more sharing economy that reduces the amount that is needed in the first place, which could be relevant to IT equipment, tech equipment, for example, but really having a robust circularity plan across your whole organization. Next slide. So just as an example, here is a company based in Perranporth, Circular & Co., who create circular design coffee cups. So what they have here are coffee cups that are made from 6 single-use plastic cups. So there's a repurposing of another project, another resources, another organization's waste into something new. They're designed to last 10 years at the minimum. So there's a long-lasting approach to that. There's not inbuilt obsolescence where they'll fall apart and you'll need to buy a new one really quickly. And they are 100% recyclable. So everything is in part of that that cup can be recycled at the end of its life, at the end of its process. But it's also modular by design. So the lids can be replaced, the bases, the seals, each part of it can be fixed, replaced, so you don't have to throw the whole thing out if anything gets damaged. So it's a really good example of a simple concept that is made much more circular than it could otherwise be. Next slide. And lastly, from me, just another few links which you can look at in your own time. There's some really good information on the University of Exeter Business School Circular Economy Masterclass site. The Ellen MacArthur Foundation have amazing resources on circularity and how that can be built into an organization. And Circular Economy organization based in the Netherlands also have some really good tips and resources. So do have a look at those and feel free to come back with us with any questions. And I will pass on.
Thanks, Peter. We've heard a lot about the climate and carbon and energy. There is, of course, an equally severe and pressing crisis, I'm afraid, in the world of nature conservation and biodiversity. As we know, the data there is as compelling and as depressing. However, there are attempts to reverse the sadness, and I very much encourage you, when you're considering applying for funding in any pot or against any call with this scheme, to really think through creatively what can be done within that confines of that project and by your enterprise to help nature. I've got 3 examples on that slide. Broadly, there's no reason why you can't familiarize yourself with all 3 of them. They all have excellent information upon them. However, they are geared towards different sorts of markets. So if you are bidding for a large amount of money and looking at some infrastructure and some substantial development and some big capital costs, or if you simply have yourself a very large estate, then please avail yourself of the Building with Nature guide and service hosted by our partners at the Cornwall Wildlife Trust. And even if you have more modest capital assets, it's true to say that anybody can do something for nature and biodiversity, pretty much, regardless of if you've just got some small bit of land and some walls even. And with that in mind, we have a live project in partnership with St Austell Brewery, actually, to look at how to improve the pub estate for nature. And now that guide is wholly applicable to anybody else of a similar sort of size. And please get in touch if you'd like a copy. And even if you are operating in a virtual space, it is nonetheless the fact that you can do something for nature and for biodiversity as well. Not least by looking at who you're buying services from, including financial services, pensions and loans and investments and banks, but also all of your suppliers as well, of course. And the more you get into thinking like that, the wider your net very quickly proves to be. I've found some useful tools are required, and the best ones that I've met I've found are Get Nature Positive. There's guides in there that are sector specific, and there are guides in there for the types of business, size of business, location of business, and so on. So please do think creatively about what you can do for nature. There's a couple of quick examples of the kinds of innovative investment we're talking about. So on the next slide, these are a couple of examples that TEVI has funded. Art Marine, who are a marine engineering company based in Cornwall, using blocks of hard substrate to make breakwaters and pilings and similar structures. And they wanted to use a substrate, a material that was not only a waste product from the China clay industries, but which also was designed and molded and specifically with the greater and more rapid colonization by plant species and animals in mind. So nature positive at the same time as circular. And on the next example, a different sort of sector from the sort of visitor economy. The PK Trust is also the name of the company that owns and operates the Porthcurno Telegraph Museum. And they wanted to do everything they could to enhance nature on their premises. And we aided them to do so. But they didn't just think of it in terms of planting and such like. They thought of it in terms of messaging, education, partnership work with their neighbours and other land holdings around them to really make the most of what they could do. And I do encourage you when you're down there to have a look. Okay, I think that's kind of enough on nature. So I'm going to throw to Jim, who will take you through some good business principles.
Thank you, Dan, and good afternoon, everybody. I'm Jim Grant. I'm Head of Business Development in Penryn for the University of Exeter, and I'm delighted to have the opportunity to talk very briefly about the good business principles in the Good Growth Programme, and I hope the information that I and my colleagues are providing you will help you to prepare the best application possible. There are three elements to the good business principles: real living wage, productivity, and some wider impacts. I'm not going to cover real living wage. My colleague Kirsten, I think, who follows me, will cover those. But I will explore requirements related to productivity, and you'll notice on the pages on productivity that I show that there are some useful references. And then I'm going to examine some approaches that will help you consider how to structure content. Anyway, productivity. Why is it important? Well, first of all, Cornwall and Isles of Scilly is below the UK average for business productivity. In simple terms, productivity is converting inputs into outputs, but it's fundamentally important in terms of influencing impacts on investment decisions. It helps businesses determine strategies related to equipment purchases, in terms of hiring people, and in terms of their organizational structure. And as you could probably guess, Cornwall and Isles of Scilly projects should contribute to improvements in terms of business productivity. Ben, could I have the next slide, please? Thank you. So the advice and guidance goes on to talk about single business applicants and what they need to do. Essentially, that's to describe where they expect to improve productivity. So, for example, it could be by reducing manufacturing times, or it could be in supporting workforce development. And of course, if you can, ideally showing evidence of growth or improvements in productivity through, for example, growth in sales. And there at the bottom of that page, when you get the slides, are a couple of useful references which will help to explain productivity in more detail than I can do today. Ben, next one, please. So in terms of larger projects, which for example you might be leading a project which works across a supply chain or is focused on a particular sector development where you're multi-partner, multi-role, there you'll need to demonstrate and illustrate where and how the expected sectoral improvements will occur. Some examples could be in terms of visibility of the sector, or enhancing supply chain activities, or creating new partnerships. Next point, please. Thank you. So, I mean, you will need to illustrate these points in your application, of course, and I would draw your attention to some additional points here that reinforce the fact that at the core of your project, your proposal, there needs to be a sound business proposition. And you need to sort of look hard and fast at yourselves in terms of, you know, do you have the right resources? Do you have the headspace? Do you have the team in place that will actually help you achieve outstanding results? And I mean, these points are at the heart of any business decision that takes you out of your comfort zone. And I think in many respects, if you're unfamiliar with grant funding, these programs might well take you out of your comfort zone. Next slide, please, Ben. Thank you. So given that the Good Growth Fund is asking you to consider the wider impacts of your project, I thought I'd share a couple of tools you might use to help you organise your thoughts and to prepare, as I say, the best application possible. The first one I want to touch on is what we call the triple layer business model canvas. I appreciate that the text is very small. Again, hopefully you'll get the slides and you can dissect this yourself. But this is quite simply a way of asking a number of questions about your business, about yourselves, and how to map your business activities, your supply chain relationships, your business processes in such a way as, you know, you can make better decisions about how you would approach the development of a new product or a new service. And really, it focuses on three areas. One is the standard economic business model canvas, which I'm sure some of you may well have used or be familiar with. The second part, though, is to extend that in terms of environmental business model canvas. And the third part is to consider the social aspects of the program project that you're developing. So if we were to break that down, if we look at the business model canvas, for example, you know, the value proposition really focuses around what it is you're offering and who benefits and why do they want it. You know, just it's a free form. You fill in the blanks as far as you possibly can, and it will help you to inform your future decision making. Having established the value proposition, then you can explore in more detail, particularly some of the things that Peter was touching on earlier, I would say, in terms of, you know, who your suppliers are, what resources you require, and what activities you might focus on that ensures that you can deliver value. And delivery of value really relates to how you maintain or increase customer relationships, what your customer segments are, and what channels you use to access those customers in particular. And obviously what you're trying to achieve there is an assessment, an overall assessment of the associated costs, which might come from marketing, production, logistics, staff, etc., and then balance that against the revenues that you might expect. So moving on to the environmental business model canvas part of it. Again, we're looking at the functional value here in terms of the types of offerings, number of offerings used by a customer in any given time frame, and then dissecting that further in terms of your supplies and outsourcing, your production methodologies, your materials. You know, for example, what are your impacts in terms of water and energy, and materials for things like packaging, machinery. Is that machinery able to be, life cycle can be extended or reused if or when you stop using it yourself, for example. Looking at and examining your production processes to see what sort of impact they have on the environment, and the same with materials. So you can dissect all these aspects here in that part of the environmental business model canvas. And then obviously looking at challenges around end of life and distribution, and in terms of use phase as I say, how does your customer use your offering? What impacts are they having? Is there an impact on the environment from the way that they use your product, for example? And similarly, do they have energy requirements? But ultimately, you have an opportunity there to produce a sort of environmental balance sheet where you're looking at the environmental impacts of your product against the environmental benefits. And hopefully you have a net gain there as well. And then finally, obviously, looking at the social business model canvas part of it, and the social value in terms of how does your organization's mission benefit stakeholders and society, and what are the implications for the product that you want to introduce on social value as well. And again, an opportunity to dissect it further in terms of relationships and impacts on local communities, how you might approach governance both within the organization and within the way you structure your project, particularly if it's multi-partner. And what are you doing for those employees that might be working within the company or on that project? What type are you looking at? Some of the sort of EDI challenges that you ought to be addressing, for example. And then taking a look at sort of wider impacts of your organization's on society. You'd be surprised how far-reaching that could be in terms of could potentially be a global impact, and what is the scale of that outreach. And in terms of the end user, does your offering meet end users' needs? How is it improving their quality of life in terms of functionality, convenience, or health, well-being, or enjoyment? And then deriving your social balance sheet in terms of the impacts that you have in terms of working hours, health and safety, and such like, against the social benefits in terms of health and well-being and inclusivity and other opportunities for volunteering or community investment, for example. Next slide, please, Ben. So my final slide, but again, one thing you might do when you're considering your application is to construct a logic model table and develop a logic model approach to how you categorize each element of the project you're working on. And this is very useful in terms of breaking it down in terms of what inputs you have, what do you need to have in place as a partner or as a group of partners, that helps to ensure that you can develop a satisfactory application, and then feed that through the program activities that you want to pursue in order to achieve your success. So some of those will be program driven, some of those will be ones that you can define for yourselves within the project program. But ultimately then what you're looking to deliver, and this is where you're really sort of selling the benefits of what you do, is looking at the results from your activities within that project in terms of the business outcomes, the environmental outcomes, social outcomes, and express all of those as outcomes or impacts. And as you can see from that table there, you have the opportunity there to explore the environmental and the circular aspects of everything that you do and in your product development. Okay, thank you. That's all from me. I'm going to pass you on to Kirsten, I think, isn't it, Dan?
Hi. Thanks so much, Jim. I'm Kirsten Whiting. I'm the project manager for the Inclusivity Project, which is a business support and research project at the University of Exeter. I'll just start with the Equality Act. Much about what's talked about in the equality and inclusive growth aspect of the Good Growth Principles comes under the Equality Act. I'm sure you know that, and I'm sure you're all aware that employers and service providers are covered by the Act, which makes it unlawful to discriminate or harass or victimise someone because they have or they are perceived to have a protected characteristic or are associated with someone who has a protected characteristic. And the 9 protected characteristics are just on the slide here. There's the legal minimum as to what you should be doing as a business, of course, but it's also worth considering what else you could be doing in terms of good practice, really, in terms of inclusion in your workplace. Hopefully there are things you're already doing that go above and beyond the legal requirements, and those things will likely be in your ED&I policy. I should point out that we are not legal experts, we're more experts in pointing in the right direction. So obviously get professional advice when necessary. I've popped a couple of links on the slide, which I know you can't click on at the moment, but if you simply Google Equality Act, you'll find all the official guidance you need, and of course you'll get the slides in due course. The next slide, please. I'm going to assume that as you're applying for good growth funding, you already have an equality, diversity and inclusion policy in place. You might be surprised to know that around half of all employers report not having an EDI policy, so well done for that not being you. What's really important is that your policy isn't just a tick box exercise. It shouldn't only cover what you must do by law, but also what else you as a business leader can do to create a culture of inclusion in your workplace. And please pay particular attention to the word culture, as that's what makes your business stand out from the others, a culture that makes people feel respected and trusted and safe, and that's what makes your team want to show up each day and do their best and to stick around. So whilst your policy is important, but living and breathing it, walking the talk is what counts, and it should benefit every single person in your business. So also it's not a static document, so do revisit it regularly, review it, update it, make sure it's remaining relevant, and make it part of an action plan for building your business. And this is why it's important. Next slide, please. Diversity enriches business. There's lots of research that shows that businesses who take inclusion and diversity seriously perform better and benefit in many other ways. People who want to work for employers with good employment practices, that's a no-brainer really. That means you reach a broader pool of talent, a wide array of perspectives and skills. That means more creative and innovative solutions for you and better understanding of your customers' needs. Developing an inclusive culture creates an environment of trust and respect, which can lead to increased job satisfaction and increased retention. A business that demonstrates its policy of equality, diversity and inclusion can also be more attractive to potential customers and clients and enhance your corporate reputation. And when we talk about diversity, don't just think about the list of protected characteristics, but also consider how you can open opportunities to young people, for example. In Cornwall, we have huge socioeconomic discrepancies, so that's something very close to home that we can make positive decisions about and include people from all backgrounds and circumstances. This isn't just me telling you these things. There's lots of research that's been done in this area. I encourage you to delve into some of it and do ask myself or colleagues if you'd like more information. Just one example, there's a report from McKinsey which came out recently which showed that companies with high gender diversity were 21% more likely to have above average profitability. And for ethnic and cultural diversity, that figure was 33%. So that it could be a huge benefit and impact on your business. Another report by Deloitte showed that the likelihood of bankruptcy is reduced by 20% if a woman is on the board. Just moving on to inclusive recruitment. Hopefully you're on a mission to recruit more inclusively. I won't pretend it's a quick fix or that there's a single way of getting it right, but it's for you to think about how to go about it and what suits your business. If we start with advertising, if you think about the language you're using, if you are looking for someone who is competitive and driven, you're likely to be excluding women. And if you are using the word dynamic, then that's much of the older workforce and introverts excluded. Also, how much of the job description, if you think about it, is actually an essential requirement? Does it really require a degree? Does it really require 5 years experience, or can you offer some training? I recently saw this little paragraph in a job advert, which I love so much, I shared it on LinkedIn, and it turned out lots of people loved it too, as it's been shared around 300 times and it's had about 10,000 reactions. And I don't even know that many people on LinkedIn, but it made me realize this inclusive recruitment thing is pretty important to a lot of people. Here's what it said. No candidate will meet every single desired qualification. If your experience looks a little different to what we've identified, and you think you can bring value to the role, we'd love to learn more about you. The traditional selection interview process is definitely due an overhaul. So it's a bit of an inefficient and slightly bonkers way of choosing the right people when you think about it. We fire random questions at people who've prepared as best they can as if it's an exam. And then we make a big decision for our business based on how well they performed under pressure and in an artificial situation. I don't know about you, but I find job interviews terrifying. We don't see people at their best in interviews. I know of a copywriting agency in Cornwall and also one of our partners, Age UK, who've changed the way they interview by sending questions or topics in advance, so nothing comes as a shock. It allows for more natural and open conversation and better connections, and it also takes a lot of stress away for any neurodivergent individuals, for example, who might prefer not to have any surprises. We also know of a tech business in Cornwall who decided to change the way they recruit by removing the traditional interview process, and instead they introduced a blind, as in the company had no idea who the applicant was, a task-based process which was tailored to the actual job that needed to be done. And what they found is that people who might not fit a traditional job description were able to successfully apply. And for example, a chef who discovered they had a love and talent for coding in their spare time was able to apply for a role that under normal recruitment processes would have been dismissed out of hand. So it's provided them an opportunity to recruit more widely and among people who are looking for a career change, and those people tend to be invested and committed to making that change work for them, but also for you. And finally, a tip that came from Cornwall Pride's recruitment practice that was a bit of a light bulb moment for me, at the point of appointing someone and sending them all the EDI forms to complete, instead of asking about accessibility and any required reasonable adjustments, they make sure that they invite everybody to a reasonable adjustments meeting, and thereby making an opt-out rather than an opt-in. So it's easier to say, no, thank you, I don't need that meeting, than it is to say, yes, please, I need to talk to you about reasonable adjustments. I hope these examples have been helpful, and you can see how tiny adjustments can make a difference. Healthy workforces, it shouldn't be any surprise that a healthy team is a productive team. And for lots of reasons, when people feel well and healthy, they're better able to focus and carry out work effectively. As an employer, you can't control how your employees live their lives, but you can support them and encourage small changes at work. There's ample research that shows that employers who invest in their employees' health, like promoting movement in the working day and providing healthy snacks and creating a pleasant and positive work environment, can see significant improvements in productivity and engagement. And don't forget, that also means a decrease in sickness absence and all the costs and the headaches of juggling of work that can cause. You don't need to suddenly get everyone signed up to the True Half Marathon, but something as simple as making lunch breaks away from the desk mandatory, or making it clear that it's okay to take a walk and get some fresh air, can be really impactful. Just one good thing came out of the pandemic. I think it's the opening up of conversations around mental health. Poor mental health is now the #1 reason for sickness absence in the UK. There is a theory that there isn't necessarily an increase in people with poor mental health, but we used to call it bad back when we used to call in sick for fear of the stigma. And maybe that's why back pain is no longer the #1 cause of absence. And if you're not sure where to start with giving your team a health kick, there's a couple of things I'd encourage. Firstly, check out the Healthy Cornwall service. There's lots of support available to get you started. They also offer mental health first aider training, which I'd really recommend. And secondly, just be a role model. Doesn't mean you have to be doing lunges and squats at the team meeting, but just do what you need to do to make it okay for people to have walking or standing meetings, for example. By doing that yourself, sedentary behaviour is literally the root of a lot of illness. So do what you can to get your team motivated to move. As Jim mentioned, I'm just going to talk a little bit about the real living wage. If you are receiving more than £50,000 from the Shared Prosperity Fund, you must pay your employees the real living wage. And that applies to any new jobs you create as well. So if you're receiving less than 50,000, you must still commit to signing up to the real living wage by the end of the project. So do write that in your business plan. The differences between the real living wage and the minimum wage, apart from the cost, is that it's voluntary. It's based on the cost of living, and it's a flat rate from the age of 18 rather than the minimum wage, which goes up by increments, up in increments by age. And the real living wage is designed to reduce poverty and inequality. I'll let you have a quick look at the graphics on the slide so you can see what's a good thing for business and your employees. And clearly the wider Cornish economy will also benefit. And while we're on the subject of wages, can I just mention the gender pay gap, which I know is something else you need to be considering to your business plans and proposals. In Cornwall, the gap is currently 15%, which is actually very slightly lower than the national figure, but it's still a significant disparity. I know the local enterprise partnership and other organisations in Cornwall are doing a lot of work around this. So if you're interested, it's probably looking into what's happening locally. Just move on quickly to skills development. Just notice we're almost up on time, so I'll rattle through. Skills development is an essential aspect of business success, and some things to think about are doing a skills audit. So not only does a skills audit highlight any gaps you might have, but in a positive sense, it can bring to light some really awesome skills you didn't know you had in your team. Creating a learning culture where your employees are encouraged to expand their knowledge and learn new skills and to take ownership of their learning and development, also a very positive mood. And do make sure that any training is inclusive. There is a huge amount of really amazing training available in Cornwall, and you don't need a massive training budget to access a lot of it. There are lots of resources available like Skills Hub, but also you should check the colleges. They all offer really high quality short courses for business. And another place to look for interesting and useful training is Eventbrite and also LinkedIn, and especially these days when there are so many online trainings and webinars. But also don't forget your most valuable resource, you and your existing team. You'll be amazed what's there already. Making skills development a priority for your business demonstrates a commitment to your workforce. It's obviously cheaper and more beneficial to upskill your current team members than it is to recruit new ones. But at the same time, if you are recruiting in the spirit of inclusive recruitment, do bear in mind that if there's a skill missing from an otherwise perfect potential employee, offer them training. Skills development is a huge topic because there's so many skills that can be developed. But as a first port of call, I'd recommend heading to the Skills Hub website. Hopefully I have time just to tell you a little bit about our research on the inclusivity project. If you could just move on, Ben, thank you. We've undertaken research in a few different areas, one being unconscious bias, and what it's confirmed is that unconscious bias training doesn't work. That might not be a surprise, but what does work is understanding and accepting that we all have biases. It's part of what makes us human, and being aware and challenging those biases when they pop up in your mind, that is what works. We've also carried out some research around barriers to employment for older people and disabled people and those with long-term health conditions, and what came through really clearly was that the barriers were perceived, they weren't real. For example, the assumption that older workers aren't good with technology or disabled people will need expensive access requirements for a wheelchair, when in fact only 8% of disabled people use a wheelchair. In Cornwall, 37% of households have one or more people with a disability, but more than half of those disabled people are not currently in work. So that's a lot of talent and knowledge being missed. And you might be surprised to know the average cost of making a reasonable adjustment is actually less than £100. We've also done some interesting work around making hybrid working fairer and more inclusive. I don't really have time to go into it now, but I'd be really happy to talk to anyone in more detail about anything I've covered here about the research. So just get in touch. I'd be really happy to talk about it. And finally, what you can do. So I've raced through all of this, but let me just leave you with a couple of thoughts for what you can do next. First of all, make the commitment to make changes in your organisation. They don't need to be huge or expensive, but committing to, say, checking the wording in your job adverts is a really good start. Secondly, walk the talk. Don't just tick the boxes. Anybody can get away with the bare minimum. If you want to be really great, if you want to be a really great business and you truly want to make a difference, which hopefully you do, you need to think about how inclusion can be embedded as second nature. And finally, don't be afraid to ask questions. The best person to tell you about reasonable adjustments needed for a disabled employee is that disabled employee. Same goes for neurodiverse employees, young employees, older female employees. I hope that's been useful. As I said, please do get in touch if you'd like any more detail on anything I've whizzed through here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kirsten. This final slide wraps up the next steps, really, for all the stuff that we've covered. so far this morning. The way the fund is managed means that the Good Growth team act as a single point of contact for matters to do with applications in all their variety. So one point of contact for nearly everything you may need to ask, certainly relating to the inquiry form and the process, calls, and most importantly, there's a useful FAQ on there already. However, if you have questions about the slides, the content of the slides, their availability, things that we've referenced in them, then please do email that email address and let us know. I will be able to sort that out. Unless there are any particular questions in the Q&A, which I'm not monitoring, but perhaps one of my colleagues might be. Is the EOI the only application form? Is the full application form available to complete this? I referred you to the answer previously given. That's one for the Good Growth at cornwall.gov.uk email. The link to the FAQ, sure. I'll see if I can just find that. But in the meantime, is there anything else? Are there any questions, Ben?
Only, yes, Claudia's asking if everyone will get slides by email, so I'll send those out this afternoon. You'll get those in your email that you signed up to this webinar with. No problem at all. Thanks everyone very much for joining us. Thanks to all the presenters. If we don't have any further questions, then I will drop you that email this afternoon, and good luck with your application.